All right, chapter 28. We're going to take a little look at the presidency of John F. Kennedy and the presidency of Lyndon Johnson. I realize we're kind of skipping a lot of the Harry Truman and Dwight Eisenhower years, but because we are pressed for time, we're going to go ahead and just jump straight to the 60s. Also, in part, we really talked a lot more about these gentlemen and their relationship to Vietnam and a few other topics. So I figured it might be worth kind of explaining. Also, really and truly, Truman's presidency was a little controversial, but Dwight Eisenhower is known for being kind of laid back and not being super involved. Um, so we're going to go ahead and go straight to 1960. The 1960 election will be remembered forever as the first television election in American history. TV had been around for a while. There had been a few television campaign spots or advertisements. TV had been available to the American public since 1948. Well, since the 48 election, I guess I should say. But it hadn't really been used largely. The majority of voters did not use TV as a way to get information, news, etc. But in 1960, that all changed. The 1960 election was the first election that really took television seriously. There were a number of advertisements. Your book mentioned the Democrats spent $6 million in television and radio advertisements. The Republicans 7.5 million. This election, John F. Kennedy, a Catholic from a wealthy family in Boston, Massachusetts, taking on Richard Nixon, a Quaker from California, from a family of modest means. Both were World War II veterans, although John F. Kennedy's World War II service a little more exciting than Richard Nixon's. But they were both relatively similar in age. Politically speaking, John F. Kennedy is a little more of a rookie. He was elected to Congress shortly after World War II, but did a very brief stint in Congress. Richard Nixon had been elected to Congress. We mentioned him actually during the Cold War. He was instrumental in the Alger Hiss case at one point, and then he served as vice president under Dwight Eisenhower. But anyhow, both men are going to have to find a way to campaign in the new world of television. This was the first campaign with televised debates, which were very important for a number of reasons. Primarily, John F. Kennedy and his team understood television a lot better than Richard Nixon. Richard Nixon did not appreciate the fact that you have to wear makeup on TV. I don't know how many of you have done anything involving theater or drama. I did in college. You got to wear makeup, even if it's just you. Without makeup, you look pale and sickly. You have bags under your eye. You just look awful, to be quite honest, without makeup, under the bright lights that are used with stage or television lighting. And John F. Kennedy's people understood all of that. So John F. Kennedy spent like an hour before a debate in makeup. And of course, Richard Nixon's people were like, Mr. Nixon, makeup. And he's like, I'm not wearing makeup. Why would I wear makeup? I'm a man. So John F. Kennedy looks all kind of tan and good looking. And Richard Nixon kind of looks pale with bags under his eye. He almost looks sickly. So there was that. And just John F. Kennedy had a better presence on television than Richard Nixon did. He came off as being a little more, I guess friendly might be the word, or likable. The major topic of this election was the Cold War. By this point, we've been in the Cold War, locked in the Cold War for over a decade. Things had really started to ramp up. As we talked about with the Cold War, the later Eisenhower years, the Cold War with Nikita Khrushchev and, U-2 spy planes getting shot down, the space race, things were getting spicy. And so a big part of the 1960 debate was who's going to be able to keep America safe in this Cold War environment. Both men, of course, claimed that they were warriors, that were going to stand up for America. One big topic, the missile gap. There was concern that America was falling behind the Soviets in all sorts of weapons and defense technology, especially missiles, which were becoming the new big threat. You can't stop a missile like you can a bomber. Truth be told, there wasn't really any missile gap. I'll go ahead and explain really quickly. America was a little behind the Russians for a brief period in missile technology. It was a very, very, very brief time period. And really, it didn't matter much. The great thing about the United States is we had allies next to the Russians. We could put medium-range missiles in Europe, which could easily hit anywhere that we needed to hit in the Soviet Union. The Soviets would have to design missiles that could fly all the way from the Soviet Union to the United States, which is a much harder process, a much more advanced technology. They did have a slight lead on this technology over us early in its technology. There was a couple years where the Russians, their rocket forces were a little ahead of ours, but not by a lot. We caught up very quickly. We overcame them very quickly. By the 1960 election, to be quite honest with you, we were ahead of the Russians. Nobody knew it. The Russians were so good at keeping their secrets, and also the space race. Every time they had a successful space mission, they touted it. They never admitted their failures. Unlike America, who was launching all of their rockets from the east coast of Florida, where people could sit on the beaches of Cocoa Beach and watch the rocket either succeed or blow up, Russian rocket launches were taking place deep in the heart of the Soviet Union, and if a rocket failed, no one knew. So all we saw was success after success, and we thought the Soviet rockets were perfect. They were having the same troubles we were having. Another one your book doesn't talk about, I have to mention this one. It's one of my favorite stories from the Cold War. There was the so-called bomber gap. We were convinced that the Russians had a huge lead on us in long-range bombers. Part of that was because they had one of their fancy military parades, and they tricked us. They flew 10 bombers past. And then, all of a sudden, 18 bombers flew past, right? Only a minute or two later. So everybody thought, like, well, there's 28 of those right there. Yeah, there were only 18 bombers. They had the 8 that flew by the first time circle back where no one could see them and join the other 8 to make it look like there were more bombers than there really were. Not long after that incident, a U-2 spy plane took a picture of a Russian airfield. It photographed 30 of these big long-range bombers. They were called the M4 Bison. 30 of them at one airfield. And everybody freaked out because we started doing the math. And we're like, okay, that's one Russian bomber base. We know the Russians have, I don't know, let's say 12 bomber bases. And so we started doing the math, and we're like, oh my God, they've got like 350 of these planes. Turns out that U-2 spy plane took the picture of every single one of those planes. They were all at the same base at the same time on the same day. There was no bomber gap. We were way ahead of the Russians. It's just we kept getting sort of tricked or confused or panicked. Regardless, the Cold War was the hot topic, right? Who's going to keep us safe? Who's going to catch up the missile gap? Who's going to close the bomber gap? All that stuff. Richard Nixon, well, of course, John F. Kennedy wanted to argue it's all the Republicans' fault. I mean, these last few years, Richard Nixon, Vice President of the United States, has been sitting there watching us fall behind. He and Dwight Eisenhower and the Republicans failed to keep us competitive. On the same token, Richard Nixon tried to counter with, we are fine, you know, we're on good course, we can catch up no problem. By the way, John F. Kennedy's going to plunge the country into massive debt with all of his spending plans. Another big topic, religion. John F. Kennedy was a Catholic. As you might remember from this class, we've only had one other Catholic candidate for a major party, Alfred Smith in 1928 for the Democrats. And there, of course, was a lot of concern about a Catholic staying loyal to America if, like, basically, would he take direction from the Pope, for lack of a better way to say it. When the votes were cast, it was razor thin, as you can see, gentlemen. Out of 68.8 million votes, the difference, about 119,000. Over 68.8 million votes. Less than 120,000 votes separated these two men. Of course, the electoral vote looks a little more broad, but these men were, I mean, in the popular vote, it's hard to get much closer than that. John F. Kennedy won a handful of important swing states by a few thousand votes. You know, if you look at our favorite county by county, you will notice that there is a lot of states where it's kind of looks like it's a little red, a little blue. I want to point out too, not a lot of places of very dark blue or very dark red. Remember, the darker the color, the more locked in it was. You'll notice a lot of places barely went one way or the other. Neither guy hit a walk-off home run on this one, okay? Now, John F. Kennedy won. He brought with him a whole aura. People like to talk about Kennedy, Camelot, as some people like to claim it. John F. Kennedy's the youngest man ever elected president, not the youngest president ever. Teddy Roosevelt was the youngest man, but he wasn't elected. Remember, he took over for William McKinley, was assassinated. But John F. Kennedy was the youngest man ever elected president. His young wife, they had two young children. You know, it was the first time in honestly, I can't tell you how long, that we have kids in the White House, and I mean, you know, younger kids. Most people got elected to the presidency. They were in their mid to late 50s. They were in their 60s. Their children were grown. You didn't have young families in the White House. And, you know, the American people kind of ate this up. The media ate it up. The American people ate it up in part because it seemed like this sort of image of like the young, vibrant America, like a new generation taking over. Also, I'd like to say John F. Kennedy, he did a good job of inspiring people. At his inaugural address, he famously mentioned how he challenged the American people. Ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. All right? Some people have heard that inaugural address statement. Now, John F. Kennedy, here was a better, I don't know why I was doing this really zoomed out view. Oh, here goes another county by county. Again, it's not a walk-off either way, really. It's pretty tight. John F. Kennedy showed up, and he had this broad plan called the New Frontier, right? He wanted to increase spending on education, provide health insurance for the elderly, create a Department of Urban Affairs to help deal with all these issues involving cities, help migrant workers, all sorts of stuff. None of it free, obviously. It's all got a price tag. And even though the Democrats won control of both houses of Congress, in the 1960 election, the Democrats had the clean sweep. They won the presidency, the House, and the Senate. John F. Kennedy found it was a rocky road. Somewhat like, you know, President Trump in some ways. You know, in 2016, Republicans won everything, and Donald Trump found out that that's not exactly a guaranteed lock to get things done the way you want them done. You see, Kennedy got elected, and then all those people in Congress didn't like John F. Kennedy. Even though they're the same party, John F. Kennedy didn't really help them. When in 1960, Kennedy campaigned for Kennedy. He really didn't come out and help people. He didn't really go and, you know, help that guy get elected to the House or do some campaign visit with him or give a rally for this guy or any of that stuff. And even in places he did, it oftentimes backfired and hurt the candidate because outside of certain parts of America, John F. Kennedy wasn't that well liked. Right? John F. Kennedy was not this household kind of name necessarily. Even in the South, you can see he wasn't as widely popular as Democrats had been down South in the past. And so John F. Kennedy was not kind of this champion of the Democratic Party. So when he shows up to the White House with this big plan, he finds out there are a lot of people in the Congress in his own party who won't support him. Southern Democrats, who tend to be more conservative, they actually line up with Republicans to oppose some of John F. Kennedy's policies. Don't forget, we talked about this in Chapter 29. John F. Kennedy had ran on pro-civil rights, and Southern Democrats aren't exactly fans of civil rights. And so his New Frontier ran into a speed bump almost immediately, right? And again, that was the name for his plan, right? We had Teddy Roosevelt had the Square Deal, and Woodrow Wilson had New Freedom, and FDR had the New Deal. Well, this is called the New Frontier, and it almost immediately has trouble getting passed. Many people argued it's too much money, it's too big, it's too costly. These Republicans are like, we're gonna pile on the debt, we're gonna pile on the inflation. This is no good. In the end, Congress shot down a lot of it. They shot down the health insurance for the elderly, the Department of Urban Affairs, a bunch of money for education. And that actually forced John F. Kennedy to basically pick and choose his battles. So, unfortunately for John F. Kennedy, he came to office in the midst of, I'm not going to say a recession, it's not a recession, but America's economy had gone from bullish growth to sluggish growth. The 50s had been great. Most of the 50s had been great. America's economy had exploded in the 1950s. But between 1960 and 1961, the growth rate dropped to only 2% per year. Meanwhile, unemployment began ticking up. The unemployment rate hit 7% by 1961, the highest number since before World War II. And in an attempt to avoid any sort of economic downturn, President Kennedy did what President Roosevelt did. He tried New Deal spending, all sorts of programs, all sorts of government spending, deficit spending, most specifically, weapons spending. If people are all fired up about the Cold War and the missile gap and the bomber gap, then give them missiles and bombers, right? The government gave contracts to companies to build all sorts of weapons. It put all sorts of people to work. Those people spent their paychecks and bought cars and washing machines, and there you'll have it. I will say, too, Kennedy was concerned, though. Before you spend all sorts of money on weapons and defense, oh, and the space race, right? John F. Kennedy, huge supporter of the space program and space race, which is not cheap either. He said we can't just spend because too much government spending leads to inflation. Kennedy said we could also boost the economy by keeping prices down, right? We don't have to necessarily generate more government spending. We could just make it easier for people to buy stuff. If we keep prices from going up, we could increase efficiency, allow companies to sell goods at a cheaper rate. So, for example, he actually fought America's unions at one point, basically telling them to hold off on demanding pay raises. He said, look, I need you guys to accept a kind of pay freeze for a while we get the economy moving again. Gentlemen, unions and the Democratic Party are peas and carrots. They go together, okay? They are peanut butter and jelly. And so here you've got a Democratic president actually telling labor unions in the steel industry, right? The steel union, one of the biggest, most powerful unions in America. He told the steel union, look, I need you guys to take a pay freeze for a while. They did. And then all of a sudden, steel companies raised their prices. Steel companies, they actually tried to price gouge. To try and force the steel industry, not the unions, but the steel industry to back down, Kennedy threatened to buy foreign steel. He actually said that America would start building her weapons using foreign steel if that's what it took. He forced America's steel companies to back down and lower their prices. John F. Kennedy also believed in practicing supply-side economics. You remember supply-side economics from the 1920s. The idea is we lower taxes, everybody's got more money, everybody spends, it leads to economic growth. Now, people argued that tax cuts really only benefited the wealthy, that only the upper class got the major tax cuts, and those are Kennedy's friends, and the average American didn't benefit. John F. Kennedy used the famous phrase, a rising tide lifts all boats, arguing, look, what's good for the wealthy is good for the poor. Everybody's getting more money, right? Everybody's benefiting from this tax cut. Now, Congress refused to pass the tax cut because it would cause inflation. And that is actually it. It wasn't about benefiting the wealthy. They were afraid of causing major inflation. But they did support plans to raise the minimum wage. They also approved a Redevelopment and Housing Act to provide funding to build better low-income housing, to clear out the slums and create jobs and help the American cities. So Kennedy lost his fight to lower taxes necessarily, but he did get some government programs to aid those that are living in poor conditions in the cities, and he did get a hike in the minimum wage. John F. Kennedy is also remembered for helping improve the role of women's rights, or the cause of women's rights. Kennedy never named a woman to his cabinet. FDR did, Kennedy didn't. But he did have a number of women in his administration. Esther Peterson, Assistant Secretary of Labor and Director of the Women's Bureau of the Department of Labor. John F. Kennedy also created the Presidential Commission on the Status of Women in 1961. This commission eventually called for federal laws or regulations to end gender discrimination and called for equal pay for female employees. In 1963, John F. Kennedy signed the Equal Pay Act, which was supposed to, again, guarantee equal pay for women in federal employment. Now, not exactly John F. Kennedy's doing, but it occurred during the John F. Kennedy years. So we're going to talk about it. The Warren Court. Okay? This is a picture of the Supreme Court during the John F. Kennedy years. This is actually the court in, I believe, this is the court. No, this is not the 1962 makeup. Your book had a 1962 makeup picture, but this is not the 1962 court. I believe this is the makeup of the court when Earl Warren took over in 1953. Earl Warren was named to be Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court by President Eisenhower. Earl Warren had been a Republican governor of California before he was named to the court by President Eisenhower in 1953. Earl Warren is going to sit in charge of the Supreme Court for well over a decade, and throughout all of John F. Kennedy's years as president. And it is under the Warren Court that many of the changes that affect your own life took place. The Warren Court has oftentimes been called one of the most activist courts in all of American history. And by activists, we mean they changed things. For example, they took on the topic of reapportionment. Now, what does reapportionment mean? Reapportionment refers to the concept of how voting districts are designed. Now, we have talked about House of Representatives before in this class, several times, a lot of times, right? There's a district for Northern Kentucky. The man who goes to Congress representing that district is Representative Massey. I can't tell you off the top of my head exactly how that district is drawn, but it's, it's like Boone and Kenton and Campbell and Pendleton and maybe Grant County and a few others, right? It's Northern Kentucky. Now, that district is relatively in population equal to the other Kentucky districts. It's not about geography. It's not about square miles. Louisville is its own congressional district. Jefferson County is its own congressional district. There is a member of the United States House of Representatives, and their entire territory, and I can't believe I can't remember the person's name. My wife would be mad at me because she's from Louisville, and she's Yarmouth, I think it is. Yarmouth. Person's been getting elected from Louisville forever. Anyhow, that person represents Jefferson County alone. Our representative represents like 7 counties. They got a person in Jefferson County in the United States House of Representatives. But you think about it. Jefferson County is the most populous county in the state by far. There are more people in that county than Boone, Kent, and Campbell combined. And so you add up all the Northern Kentucky counties, we have roughly the same population as Jefferson County. And that is why there's a representative from our area and then one from Jefferson County. The theory being the vote of a Northern Kentuckian for Congress is equal in strength to the vote of a person in Louisville, right? And that was the glaring call or battle cry. One man, one vote. That in an ideal world, one person's vote, one man's vote is equal to another man's vote. There would be no discrepancy in political power, right? Well, you got to think the districts hadn't been changed a whole lot. Districts had stayed relatively the same for a long time. But America had dramatically changed. Populations had moved and shifted. And America was a far more urban country than it had once been. But districts had not changed, okay? Especially at the state level. States had been very reluctant to change their state legislative voting districts. And so what you had, for example, in Tennessee by 1960, you had a rural county with 2,340 voters in it. They elected a representative to the state legislature. There was an urban county, 133 times the number of voters. They only had 7. So you've got 2,340 people, and they elect a state legislator. And then you've got a county with 311,000 people. They get 7 representatives. Or a district, I should have said a county, right? That's not fair, right? And so there was a Supreme Court case. The case obviously started at the lower level, but the case of Baker v. Carr. In 1962, this case made its way all the way to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court ruled that federal courts could hear cases involving lawsuits claiming that voting districts, were not fairly drawn up. So the Supreme Court did not rule that you had to change the voting districts. The Supreme Court ruled that you could send a lawsuit against the U.S. government for voting discrimination to the court system. Fast forward 2 years to Reynolds v. Sims, in which the Supreme Court actually did say that federal congressional districts were not constitutional the way they were currently drawn up. Reynolds v. Sims actually said you've got to redraw the voting districts for the Congress, that they are blatantly unfair. And so this was, again, an attempt to get us closer to one man, one vote. What this ended up doing long term is shifting political power from the rural areas to the cities, because we now said that basically congressional districts should be relatively equal in population, right? And as I just told you, you've got like 6 counties in Kentucky got 1 representative. You got 1 primarily urban county has a representative, right? And so people living in large cities suddenly found that they were more represented than they had been in the past. And that means a shift in political power in this country, because people living in urban environments tend to be more likely than not Democratic voters. I'd also like to point out this was a win for minorities like Hispanics and African Americans, who generally lived a little more often in urban areas than in rural areas. Now, another thing that the Warren Court is famous for, and anyone who takes my government class is well versed in these because we talk all about these cases, extending the right of due process. Okay, in the 1960s, the Warren Court took the 14th Amendment to the Constitution. The 14th Amendment is the one that says that no state shall deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process. Due process is a term that means you get that everyone goes through a standard legal procedure that guarantees that every step along the way certain rights are protected and preserved and all these other things, right? The Supreme Court began to take the 14th Amendment and apply it to the rights of the accused, right? Of accused criminals. And so you're going to have a string of cases in the early and mid 1960s where the Supreme Court is over and over again going to argue in favor of the people who've run into the justice system. Mapp v. Ohio, your book very quickly mentions that in Mapp v. Ohio, state courts could not consider evidence obtained in violation of the federal Constitution. I'll give you the really quick summary. Doreen Mapp was a woman living in northern Ohio. The police entered her residence searching for a suspect in another crime. They had a hot tip, and they thought that person was there, and they went in without a proper search warrant. While they were in there, they found some illegal pornography. She was charged for possession of that illegal pornography. She eventually won her case. That the Supreme Court said you can't use that against her in a court case because you all never would have known that that was there had you not kicked in the door without a valid search warrant. Basically, you all found evidence that you had no right to find because you had no right to be there because you broke the law kicking in the door like you did. And so Mapp v. Ohio is what basically forces the police to make sure they have a valid search warrant, and any evidence that they obtain illegally is inadmissible. What that means is it can't be brought up in trial. It cannot be used against you, right? If the police just go start searching your home without a search warrant because they think you're, a dirty person, and they find all sorts of illegal stuff, it can't be used against you in a court of law because they had an illegal search. Now, the next one I'll mention is Gideon v. Wainwright. In 1963, the court ruled that a defendant in a state court had the right to a lawyer regardless of his or her ability to pay for said lawyer. Mr. Gideon, I can't remember the state, now I'm mad at myself. I want to say he was in jail in Louisiana. I do know Mr. Gideon could not afford a lawyer at his case. and was or could not afford a lawyer, so he didn't have an attorney for when he was questioned or anything, right? Or when he went to trial. Well, he actually applied to the Supreme Court using paper from the prison library. It's in our government book. Mr. Gideon's filed his petition to have his case heard by the Supreme Court using paper that the librarian at the prison let him use, because he had no other resources. And the Supreme Court ruled that a person has the right to a court-appointed attorney, that even if you can't afford one, one will be provided for you. 1964, Escobedo v. Illinois, the Supreme Court ruled that you have the right to have a lawyer present when you are questioned, not just when you are on trial, when you are being questioned. And then the last one, Miranda v. Arizona. This came up because a man, Mr. Miranda, was arrested. Mr. Miranda was being questioned by the police. He mentioned about having a lawyer, and they didn't say, no, you can't have one. They said, you don't want one because, they'll just make it harder. We're going to offer you a deal. But they basically just kind of ignored his question. No one said you have the right to a lawyer. The guy was like, should I have a lawyer? They didn't say you have the right to a lawyer. They said, you don't want a lawyer. And he eventually was convicted, and it turns out they tricked him into a confession, basically. And eventually his case, he won his appeal, the case of Miranda v. Arizona. Many of you are familiar with Miranda and you don't know it. If you've ever watched a person get arrested in a movie, on TV, maybe in real life, you've seen a person, as the police are arresting them, you are informed. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can or will be used against you in a court. You have the right to an attorney. If you cannot afford an attorney, one will be provided for you free of charge. Do you understand these rights? Those are called your Miranda rights or your Miranda warning. It comes from this very case. Okay? The man whose case went all the way to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said, yeah, this guy, we just said a couple years ago, this guy has the right to have a lawyer, and when the guy asked about a lawyer, you guys are like, you don't want a lawyer. Like, you guys violate Escobedo. So they established that policy. Now, I want to point out, this was not popular with a lot of Americans. Why? Let's take a moment and think about it. In all of these cases, who are we ruling in favor of? The accused, the criminals. We're overturning convictions. We're making life awful hard on the police. For a lot of Americans, it looked like we were giving all the criminals all the advantages, and we were stacking the deck against the police to where they would never be able to convict anyone of anything. I guess it all is in the eye of the beholder, right? I mean, I personally have not run afoul of the police at any given time, really. I've never been charged with a crime or anything of that nature. I've never been arrested. Now, I hope I never am, but I do like that I have these safeguards that make sure that the police aren't able to basically kind of make the rules up as they go. There's a very clear due process that you, anyone in this country are assured of to make sure that we have every chance to prove our innocence. If you think about it, it's up to the law to prove our guilt, right? We are innocent until proven guilty. They've got to establish our guilt. I should not have to run around proving my innocence. They should have to prove I'm guilty. And these are all designed to help basically assure that we maintain our innocence until we are proven guilty. So, I don't like crime. I'm not pro-criminal, but I do like the fact that the Supreme Court stated these things to guarantee that, let's say you were falsely accused. These are all things that will help a falsely accused person be able to defend their innocence, right? But anyhow, I do want to go ahead and touch upon really quickly too, the Supreme Court dealt with the topic of prayer and privacy and things of that nature. In the case 1962, Engel v. Vitale, as you can see up here, the Supreme Court decided that states could not compose official prayers and require them to be recited in public schools. Public schools, right? And they made it clear it has nothing to do with from the Bible or from the Rosary or what. It was just prayer. That there was no reason for there to be a prayer in a public school. The very next year, Abington School District v. Shemp, the court ruled against Bible readings in public schools. In 1965, the court ruled in Griswold v. Connecticut. It's not up here, but I'll mention it. Griswold v. Connecticut, that state laws that prohibited the sale and use of birth control violated a constitutional right to privacy. Okay? And then there was one up here too, New York Times v. Sullivan, that basically made libel law a little more difficult. The idea here, the reason this gets chunked in here, is about freedom of speech. Basically, this was designed to guarantee the freedom of the press and make it to where celebrities, media personalities, political leaders could not shut down newspapers or the media or just sue people to prevent them from publishing things they didn't like. It made it to where there are clearer rules on suing if you are what is considered a celebrity. Now, as I said before, we did this quick rundown of some of the Supreme Court highlights. Oh, one that I forgot, by the way, 1967, states may not ban interracial marriage. Most folks don't know this, but there were a number of southern states that actually had laws prohibiting the marriage of African Americans and non-African Americans up until 1967. And I do like to point out that if I'm not mistaken, this was part of the argument made for overturning the ban on gay marriage in our country. People pointed out that some of the wording that was used in the case of Loving v. Virginia, could be used in the case that involved trying to overturn the ban on gay marriage. Sorry, I forgot about that one. We already talked about Brown v. Board. Now, the Warren Court, the decisions are highly controversial, right? It depends on your point of view. Some Americans, oh, you're making it easy for the criminals. Other Americans said, good. This protects innocent people from mistakes in the justice system or dirty cops or whatever, right? One man, one vote, good. But then you had some people who are like, yeah, separation of church and state. But then you had people who are like, no, we need religion and faith. It all depends on your point of view. It all depends on your political perspective. The New York Times, a writer for the New York Times, Anthony Lewis, he wrote in the New York Times that the Warren Court had, quote, brought about more social change than most Congresses and most presidents. And there is a lot of truth to that. Again, a lot of these have stood since they were ruled on 50 plus years ago. They have stood and have not been changed. Some of them have actually multiple times been brought back up and again reasserted as being the law of the land. And so the court left an indelible mark on the United States, the Warren Court did. In the next section you'll have to read, we will look at John F. Kennedy's presidency and the Cold War a little more. But again, that is for the next lecture.